So today I want to talk to you about displacement. To understand displacement, first, you have to understand what is going on inside of what we consider like a 2D visualization or a 2D texture space. So I have just a photograph, just a public domain photo of a parrot. And one of the really essential things about computer graphics is this idea of a red, green, and blue channel. You see, all of your images are actually three, or depending on the type of image, if it has transparency, four channels. And if I turn these off one at a time and just activate one of them, you can see that the red channel is actually a black and white channel where white denotes where red would go, and black denotes where there isn't any red. And the same thing happens with the green channel, where it's showing up very, very dark, where very little green should shine through, and it's showing very, very white, where there should be green showing through, as well as our blue channel. So you can see the difference between blue and red in terms of what they're showing. This fourth channel is the alpha channel, which we'll talk about when we get into foliage, which basically decides where the image does and doesn't see things. But what we can see is when we combine these back together, you get all of your colors in there. And so what you're looking at when you're looking at an image is actually several black and white pieces of information stacked on top of each other. This is really important because that black and white information we can use for a ton of stuff to basically mean it's a 0 or it's a 1 or it's somewhere in between. And then we really have control over what's showing through. We can see, just like I was saying, with these channels, it's not enough that it's not pure white, it's some close proximity to white, which is saying how much red is allowed to be in this is how white it is. And so those numbers in between 0 and 1 are really important. So inside of Blender, you may have noticed that there are all these generate modifiers we use a lot of, but there's also a series of deform modifiers. And let's talk since something relatively simple, because it's a plane is easy to see what I'm going to do on it. So let's start by throwing on a just displacement modifier. The displacement modifier, you'll notice as soon as I do it, it moves it up by this value, by their mid-level value, which is 0.5. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's moved up 0.5 already. And all this is doing is it's just lifting this object with whatever information I give it. Right now I'm not giving any information, so it's just lifting it all together. However, if I go to this little new, I can add a new texture. Now it went straight down because I've added a new texture, but it's all 0 information in it. So it's actually pushing itself backwards by 0.5. Now what I want to do here is I have this texture 0, 1. Let's call it, because it's mine, so I can name it what I want, Disp Demo, just so we can see what's going on. And I have a couple options. I could click this here, which links to whatever I have selected, or I could select this little texture properties tab. And now I have my little display demo. I could load a separate texture in, but I like that I'm working with this one here. And under type, instead of image or movie, I want to set this to, let's say clouds. Clouds is a pretty good one because we can see what's happening is black and white. Now, as I'm messing with this, you see the object is kind of wobbling around. What's happening is it's lifting and it's lowering depending on what information is underneath it. Now, as it so happens, this object, from a standpoint of wireframe, all of its verts are being pushed up or down based on whether there's black or white underneath it. The problem here is that it's really hard to visualize without also being able to have more points. So I'm going to add another modifier. I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier, and I'm going to drag it before it displace. I'm going to set it to simple. Simple keeps it from smoothing out and just makes it nice and straight. And I'm going to up the numbers as high as it goes, so something like 6. And now you can start to see these ridges. So if I come back into clouds and I start playing with the size and scale, you see in my preview, as the size and scale changes, it's pushing up on the white and down on the black. Things like depth will change sort of like the roughness or noise to what I'm doing. And I also have the option to choose things like colors, which is my intensity or how strong my contrast is. It'll also clamp to like levels, or if I don't want clamping on, will keep me from being able to like have that specific, like those little kind of clamped on. So this is something we can use to control overall our final image. And like we can generate from this lots of interesting stuff. In this case, we're going to be using it from the classes to actually make terrain for us, because we can see here, it starts to feel like mountains or rocks as we play with it. But there's a lot of other information that can be passed through, and this is where that whole shader thing kind of comes into play. So I'm going to take you over into the shading tab here, and we can do some similar things with this. So I'm going to take this object, I'm going to create a new shader, and I want to start mixing up shaders together. So right now I have this principled BSDF on it, which is the sort of main thing we use. We can, as we've seen before, we can change its color. Let's actually turn this on, and we can choose things like how rough it's supposed to be. So we can make it really shiny or really harsh. And the question becomes like, well, what if I wanted more information on that? What if I wanted more of a texture on it? Well, we can start plugging things in together. So I can take now what's called a mix node, and we're going to look at a mix shader node. And a mix shader node takes in green, which means it's a shader, and it outputs green, which means it outputs a shader. And if I stick it right on top of this, it's going to mix between two different shaders. I don't have one, so I'm going to hit Control D. I'm going to make another shader. I'm going to make this one red. I like to use blue and red a lot to like help me visualize what's going on. And I could plug this back into the second shader. It's just going to turn purple right now to some extent. Why is it turning purple? Well, it's mixing those two in 50-50. So if my factor is 1, it's going to use the bottom, and if it's 0, it uses the top. This is where things get really interesting. If I add now a noise texture to this, or like let's just do a noise texture, which is a lot like a clouds. And I take this noise texture, which I know if you have node editor plug hooked in, and I control click it, it's going to blend up this black and white this way. If I take this, and instead of plugging this black and white information straight into my color, if I instead take this black and white information, I plug it into factor, which is going 0 to 1, it's going to do the exact same thing for me, but instead it's going to decide where it shows through one texture and where it shows up the other. So now let's play, playing with my scale, you can see I'm actually painting onto it some of my roughness settings. And also, another thing I can do if I really want to tighten things up, one of my favorite shader things is a ramp, because now I can say, take those black and white values, and by changing where they are on this ramp, I can take the white and the black and clamp them closer to each other so they have less transition. Basically, this is the decision of like black to white. So I'm saying, hey, how far gray can it get before I decide it's just black? And this is what I'm doing, is I'm just saying, hey, anything under this darkness, under this position of 0.3, any value under that, it becomes black. And I can say, hey, anything above 0.5 becomes white. And this is how we're clamping things out. We're kind of using it like a mask to decide which one goes through where. Now, you could totally paint this by hand. The advantage here is it's procedural. So if I want to come back in and change a color to something else, I can. If I want to come back in here and I want to change the roughness of this value, it's really easy to do. So this kind of things is like a technique we're going to use a lot, especially when working something that's as large of a scale as an environment, because we want to be able to make changes, we want to be able to reuse stuff, and we want to be able to save ourselves time. So this is basically the same placement. You might have noticed there's a little displacement value in here. Since we're using primarily Eevee, which is all real time, that's not actually for us, but it does work for cycles. Instead, we're just going to use the displace node here, which functionally does the exact thing. So that is a little introduction to displacement and getting you to start thinking about these shaders and all this stuff as information passing in. See you in the next one.